Well, the Second Amendment is the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and that leaves them with the authority and the power to be the last say-so in fighting off tyrannical government. And the one thing that the Democrats and the liberals and a lot of people make a mistake about is that the first part of the Second Amendment, where it says a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Well, some people think that the reference to militia is talking about the Army or the National Guard. Well, there's two things wrong with that. The National Guard wasn't formed until 100 years later, and the Founding Fathers didn't even like the idea of a standing army. So they certainly weren't guaranteeing the right of soldiers to keep and bear arms.
The discussion, they say, well, they never envisioned machine guns, and yet they did have weapons that were capable of firing multiple rounds at once. In fact, they were experimental, but they did exist. They knew about them. Personally, I think it's one of those balance issues that if a person can engage their target.
Well, the Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't specify what type of arms, and it doesn't specify pistols, shotguns, rifles, assault rifles, whatever. It says arms. So I think what you just described there, the fact that a populace should be able to defend itself from their government, if necessary, includes the right to have any sort of weapon that the federal government or any government has.
I draw my line in the sand when I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I can feel it and see it, taste it, that my rights are being violated. That's when I take a stand.
Would you be willing to be force vaccinated?
No.
Then would you be willing to go to a quarantine camp?
No.
What do you plan to do if they come knocking on your door?
Well, you bring your syringe, I'll bring my 40.
Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for electing me to another term as sheriff. I want you to know that I appreciate it, and that I will continue to do my best to make this city and, well, to make this county a place where we can be proud to raise our children.
The most powerful public servant in the county, who is the sheriff. The sheriff can kick the feds out of their county. The sheriff is the most powerful individual. But instead, they've been taught that they have no power. And in many states, they're getting rid of the sheriff or turning the sheriff into a creature of the state or a creature of the city. Cities are chartered by the state under the rules of the state and the county. So again, it's backwards.
That the sheriffs in this country really take their job seriously in protecting and serving the people of their county. And yes, the best protection you can give your people, Sheriff, is protection from tyrants. And my question is, Sheriff, will you stand against tyranny? If you won't, then you're not doing your job.
You can move out in the middle of the desert and get together with a couple hundred of your friends and found a city. You could hire your own police. You can go set up speed traps out on the highway and pull over unsuspecting families that are out there, driving by as tourists. But the minute you start violating the county laws and the state laws, you are involved in criminal activity. The cities are simply incorporations. And so they are trying to overthrow the sheriffs. They are trying to overthrow the legislatures through these agreements they're signing with the federal government and the United Nations.
We've always been swindled in one way or another. We just refuse to accept that it's happening again. We get trusting. And, between COINTELPRO, Project Megiddo, this is just another example of it with the Obama White House.
A lot of people get confused. They think that communism is for the people. But if you study history in depth, you will learn that big central banks and powerful robber barons actually funded communism as a way to con the people back into serfdom, back into slavery. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto and compare it to the laws that the Federal Reserve has lobbied to be passed in the United States and also in Europe, it's identical.
the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, how many have already been implemented in this country, like, for example, a graduated income tax, like our federal income tax, and others.
The Communist Manifesto was the concept of having a what they call a state bank with massive capital, and that's, of course, the Federal Reserve System. It's not entirely a state bank because it's tied in very closely with the private banking system. You have really a cartel structure there. But it's a state bank in the sense that it's a product of statute. Obviously, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. Those private bankers wouldn't have that authority if it weren't for that statute. Now, the other area that the Communist Manifesto, of course, was interested in was that it's developing now is this concept of all land was going to be owned by the state. Well, we're coming into that same type of relationship. The land is not all going to be owned by the state, but it's going to be owned by these huge agribusinesses, which are interlocked with the state, these huge agricultural corporations or cartels, which are interlocked with the state in the same way, in essence, that the Federal Reserve is interlocked with the state. So they have a lock over our food supply in the same way that the money people have a lock over our money and credit supply. Right? And it's the same structure. What they learned was the communist system of centralized bureaucracy doesn't work. You need to have centralized bureaucracy interrelated, interleaved, if you will, with quote-unquote private enterprise.
Communism is an evil theory. It is evil at its inception because its overall purpose, its goal, is to eliminate private property and therefore eliminate your rights, including your right to life. Because if the government decides that you are taking up too much space or eating too much food or not complying with the government's demands, then you will simply be eliminated because you have no rights.
This is a very sophisticated, nuanced issue. The similarities between the Civil War in the 1860s between the North and the South and what's happening today with the Declaration of State Sovereignty. We have to be very careful. If you study the history of what happened then, this is on record, mainline history. The British came in and funded the South to begin breaking away from the North, knowing that it would create a protracted war that would weaken the entire system.
Whereas what we're talking about today in terms of these state rebellions, if you will, against federal usurpation is the same in essentially every state. Now, it may not be the same in the sense that the legislature of Massachusetts may not feel as threatened by national health care as the legislature of South Carolina does, but there are a heck of a lot of people in Massachusetts who feel threatened, and a heck of a lot of people in South Carolina who feel threatened. And eventually, if enough people in Massachusetts feel threatened, that legislature will change its tune.
The people in Washington are making decisions that benefit themselves. The American people are beginning to realize that, and we are undergoing a second American Revolution. We're undergoing another change in the way that people think.
Right now we have foreign offshore banks coming in, controlling the federal government to engage in all these oppressive and tyrannical operations against the states that has the states declaring their sovereignty and some threatening to secede, which will then provoke a national crisis, which is what the globalists want. Instead, we need the states to declare their sovereignty, but not secede, and point out that the federal government itself has already seceded to international control. It's not the states that are trying to secede, it's the states that are trying to get the federal government to follow the Bill of Rights and Constitution and not be a gang of traitors and crooks, a bunch of mercenaries working at the behest of offshore corporations.